Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Lesson 17 series continues. This time in this lesson we're going to cover a brand new concept, and if you actually look at it, so we're only going to focus everything inside this green box. Okay. If you look at them, you'll notice something very peculiar about all of these, and that is that they all have this tiny little noon there, right? So if you look at it, there's these tiny little noons. These little noons have a very special name, and they're there for a specific purpose, which is beyond the scope of this class for us to understand why they're there. For our purposes, we just need to know how to recite them when they show up. We call these little noons Noon Qutni. Now, Noon Qutni could show up either in the beginning of a verse or it could show up in the middle of the verse. If it shows up in the middle of the verse, it must be recited. So if you look at this first example right there, it does show up in the very middle, in which case that Noon Qutni needs to be recited. But if you look at the second box right here, the Noon Qutni actually shows up in the beginning of the verse, right? It comes right after the waqaf. In that case, you do not need to read it. Instead, you would read the alif. So then the question is, why do they put that there? Remember in the previous lesson I told you that it is permissible to jump over a waqaf and not to stop. That Noon Qutni is there in case you want to jump the waqaf, in which case if you choose to jump the waqaf, then you do need to recite the Noon Qutni. So I'm going to give you a little taste of what it sounds like. So let's just go over this first one really quickly. A, da. Okay, so that Noon Qutni, very simple. You're just going to read it as if a noon was there. That noon is connecting to lam, so it becomes nil, and now that right there is alif with the dhamma on it, so it becomes la. Very simple. Ada nil ula. All I did, I just recited the Noon Qutni as if it's just a noon. So here's the next one. Let's just go through it. Lu ma zati waqaf lumazah. Okay. And if I continue through here, I don't need to recite the Noon Qutni. But then the question becomes, well, do I just start from the lam or do I start from the alif? The answer is you would start from the alif, and that actually creates more questions. Does that alif have a fatha? Does it have a kasra? Does it have a dhamma? In almost every single mushaf that I've looked into, whenever there's a Noon Qutni in the beginning of the verse, that alif will not have any kind of vowel sound, and it's really hard to tell what vowel sound should be on it. So if you're not an Arabic speaker, it's really hard to tell. What I like to do is, if there's a Noon Qutni, I will purposely jump the ayah just to recite the Noon Qutni. In this case, it is a fatha, right? So you would simply recite it as alladhi. But say you didn't want to stop there and you want to continue, it would be recited as so. Lu ma za ti nilla dhi. Put it all together. Lumazati nilladhi. So that's what I'm going to do whenever there's a Noon Qutni in the beginning of the ayah. For the next couple, what I'm going to do is I will do an example of us stopping, and then I will do an example of us jumping over the waqaf and continuing through it. Okay. So here's this first one. Fa khu ra. Now I didn't really mention this before. Yes, there's a waqaf, and yes, there should be an imaginary sukoon on the ra. But even though there is that imaginary sukoon on ra, there is still this alif, right? Which means we still need to stretch it even though there is a waqaf. So once again, it would still be fakhura. Okay? And over here I'm going to put a little fatha there. So it becomes alladhina. Now let's go through it again. This time we're going to jump the waqaf. Fakhura nilla dhina. Notice how I jumped over the alif, right? Because if we're going to continue through the waqaf, that alif doesn't have any, fatha kasra or any harakat on it. And we've been talking about this since day one. If there's nothing on it and it's in the middle, you would completely skip it. So here we go. So now we would say فَخُورًا الَّذِينَ. Next one. قَدِيرُ. Waqaf. Qadir. And then again I'll put a fatah here, so it becomes alladhi. Now let's say we want to jump the waqaf, so it would be qadiru nilladhi. Qadiru nilladhi. So now here we come to the last one that we're going to practice for now. There is that Noon Qutni. It's in the middle of the verse, so we're just going to recite it like a regular Noon. Nu, hu, niba, so there should be a qalqal on the ba. Na, hu, nu, hu, niba, nahu. Noon Qutni will show up in the Quran. If it's in the middle of the verse, very easy, just read it like any other noon. If it's in the beginning of the verse, you don't have to read it, just make sure you know the vowel sound that the alif should have with it. It's probably just safer to continue through the waqaf and to recite that Noon Qutni. And so in the next video, we're going to talk about one more tajweed rule. So over here we talked about these little noons. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about these little memes. Okay. We're going to talk about them and we're going to talk about what they mean. So if my explanation for Noon Qutni wasn't comprehensible or you didn't, maybe it could have been a little bit better, check the description below. There is another concise video talking about Noon Qutni and they'll go into more detail, but it is also very concise and to the point. I do encourage you to check it out when you get a chance. For now, I'm going to pause and I will start up the next video, and that is inshallah where I hope to see you. Please keep me in your du'as. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.